Hello and welcome. If you're new here, my name is Joe and I rant about the things that I think we need to do to prepare for the coming effects of climate change. If you've been here before, welcome back. In this video, the looming housing crisis that no one is talking about. Now, housing crisis can mean different things to different people. A financial housing crisis can refer to a sudden drop in home prices such that some homeowners end up underwater on their mortgage and that they owe more than the house is actually worth at that point. A housing crisis can also refer to a lack of affordable housing, which increases homelessness. I'm going to talk about a housing crisis a little bit differently, which you'll see here in just a moment. So let's look at some numbers. Now, I got these from the Census Bureau. These are through 2019, and don't worry about what the actual numbers are. It's the scale of the numbers, it's the size of these numbers that really matters. What you're looking at here is a breakdown of the different types of housing that currently exist. I've broken this into condominiums, manufactured houses, mobile homes, and trailers I've lumped together. Single-family homes, which refers to most likely a house, and multifamily buildings, which refers likely to an apartment building. Could be anything from a duplex to a building with 50 or more apartment units. Some condos do get rented, some houses get rented, some trailers get rented, but this is the way the Census Bureau had these things broken out. And then the all housing column is just the total of the other four columns. One weird thing about the way these numbers are presented is that they're expressed in thousands. So for example, at the top under condos, that 745 is really 745,000. All housing built from 2010 to 2019 is not 9,944, it's 9,944,000. So you need to add 3 zeros to the end of all of these numbers to get them accurate. But anyway, this breaks them down anywhere from all the houses or all the housing that was built that is currently occupied or available to be occupied by decade, and finally just anything between before 1940 and earlier is all lumped together. So let's take a look at this in graphical form instead of in a chart. This might be a little easier to digest. And again, it's not the numbers themselves that makes the difference, it's the magnitude of the numbers. So we have a lot of houses that were built, or a lot of housing units that were built before 1940, but otherwise anywhere from really 1970 through 2000, well, before the 2008 crash anyway, a lot of housing was built. And if we break this down a little bit further, single-family homes, a lot of single-family homes were built after World War II. So really from the 1950s through 2008, a lot of homes were built, a lot of houses were built. There's still quite a few remaining that were built before 1940. In fact, some cities, such like Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, have hundreds of thousands of homes that were built before 1920. I'm talking between 200 and 300,000 per city. So this is the breakdown for single-family homes. Multifamily, you know, the older they get, the more they seem to turn into rental housing. Which I'll address in just a moment as to why that is important. Condominiums got really popular in the 70s, a lot were built in the 80s, and then during the housing boom of the early 2000s, a lot of condominiums were built. As far as manufactured houses, this really wasn't a thing until the 1990s. Manufactured homes or mobile homes or trailers that people lived in. Going back to the 1950s, these things weren't meant to last more than 10 years. Once you get into the 70s, they started being built to be a lot more durable. And then as you can see, their popularity peaked in the 90s. And then in the 2000s have dropped as other housing has become available for people to choose from, which made manufactured housing less of a desired option. But anyway, what's important about all this is the lifespan of any of these buildings ranges from anywhere from 30 to 50 years for a manufactured home, around 50 years for a condominium or an apartment building, and 70 to 100 years for a single family home, or in other words, a house. Now, a house can last more than 100 years. So there are houses out there that have lasted 2, 3, 400 years. There are very few of them. Of course, 400 years ago, there were few houses to then last this long anyway. But there are still some around. There are some examples of homes that have lasted centuries. So it is technically possible for these things to last. But the thing is, in recent decades, especially during the housing boom of the 50s and 60s, houses were not built with durability in mind. They were built, entire neighborhoods were just cranked out as quickly as possible. Subdivisions were built as quickly as possible. A lot of building codes didn't even exist yet. So houses were built quickly, cheaply, and then just sold off without really considering what kind of condition they would be in many decades later. So houses built today could perhaps last 100 or more years, but the issue is, what about the houses that were built many decades ago? If we just assume that 100 is a decent number to expect, but 70 might be more realistic, given that, again, building codes didn't really come into existence until the 50s, and there were all different versions of foundations used up until that time as well. Once a foundation goes, a house is really in trouble. Once a house experiences a major incident like a flood or a fire, it could be water damage could come from anything from a roof failing to a flood. So water could come in from above or below. Or again, a fire, smoke damage, anything that that potentially damages the structural integrity of the home. A lot of times what's done is cosmetic to patch over that. So while a house could last 70 to 100 years, many aren't. So what you're looking here is, you're looking at a table of where I've highlighted in red all the different types of housing that are reaching the end of their expected life cycle. So for condos, manufactured houses, apartment buildings, anything greater than 50 years old is now entering their end of life cycle phase. Houses greater than 70 years old, they're entering their end of life cycle phase. Now the other thing is, those numbers, and they vary all over the place in terms of what the source of the data is, but also more importantly, how well maintained was the house over time. A house that's not well maintained won't last 50 years. A condo that's not well maintained won't last 30 years. So let's take a look at these numbers. I just highlighted in orange here the number of condos or houses or multifamily homes. Again, these could be apartments or duplexes or anything in between that are in that 30 to 50, or for houses 50 to 70 year lifespan, or how old they are currently, which means that if we assume that anywhere from a small percentage to a large percentage of some of these houses have not been well maintained over time, then they too are entering their end of life cycle phase. So let's get to again, don't worry about the actual numbers themselves here. It's the scale that matters. It's the size of these numbers that matters. So let's look at how these all add up. So going into this decade, approximately 32 million homes, home being anywhere from a house to a condo to a trailer, are entering their expected end of life phase. The number is 41 million if those numbers in orange. If 25% of them, housing that should last another 20 years or more, hasn't been well maintained to the point that they are also now entering their expected end of life phase. The number is 50 million if half of the current housing that should last another 20 years hasn't been well maintained. In a generation from now, let's take all the current housing and add another 20 years to each of their ages. Then it could be anywhere from 60 to 80 million of today's current homes that will be entering their end of life phase a generation from now. So today's kids, who are tomorrow's potential homeowners, what are they going to buy? So here is where the crisis comes in. What were we going to do with all of these old houses or all of these old apartment buildings? I mean, what we've done to this point is just maintain them as best as we can, or as best as people can afford, or as best as they are forced to. One thing that was interesting to me was the breakdown of multifamily homes and how old those are, because I think that's what's going to continue to happen. Here's how things fall apart, in my view. I believe what's going to happen is, as houses get older, as buildings get older, more and more insurance companies will refuse to insure them. No insurance company is going to cover a building that looks like it's about to fall over. you can't get a mortgage if you can't get insurance. And if you can't get a mortgage, that means these buildings will only be available for those who can pay cash. So only the wealthy will be able to afford these buildings. What will you then do with a building that you can't sell to somebody else? Why would you buy one of these buildings if you can't then sell it to someone else except to get cash from them? Well, turn it into rental housing. Because if you don't have to maintain it, I mean, if things are grandfathered in as far as building codes are concerned, what will happen is more people who can't afford better housing will just accept anything over their head. So more and more of these structures are going to become uninsurable, unsellable, and they're all going to turn into low-income housing, if any housing at all. We may be looking at entire abandoned neighborhoods, entire abandoned towns. Unless we demolish them all? I mean, what are the two options? Demolish all of these structures? What would we do with all the debris? Not demolish all these structures? We'll end up all the abandoned towns or neighborhoods. We need to figure some things out here. I think one thing we need to do is establish a deconstruction business. If you're going to demolish a house, you're going to bring in a bulldozer and a bobcat and knock it down and dump it into some dumpsters and have them hauled away. But you can't do that if you're talking about an entire neighborhood or an entire town. I mean, buildings get to a point where it is cheaper to actually knock it down and rebuild it than it is to fix it. So people are just going to do neither. So these buildings are going to end up more and more dilapidated until that's the case on a large scale. I'm talking about tens and millions of homes. If we were to replace them, so this is really a double crisis, because number one, the people who currently reside in these houses, where will they live 20 years from now? And if they all have to move out of these buildings, again, what do we do with them? So again, number one, we need a deconstruction industry where it's not enough to just send in a bulldozer and a bobcat. We need to break these houses apart, one window at a time, one board at a time, potentially one nail at a time. Separate out the materials and figure out what can be recycled, what can be melted down and reused, what can be turned into something else, what's left that we have to find a way to dispose of, and do everything possible to minimize that. And number two, we need to figure out a whole new way of building houses so that we're not building houses that are expected, that we're going to have to tear down many decades from now. I think it's actually better to not only build houses with deconstruction in mind at the end of their life cycle, but actually to build houses where parts can be swapped out, like in a car. Pretty much the only thing you can't swap out in the car is the chassis or the frame. I mean, with a house, maybe that's actually possible if we engineer that. But we need to completely rethink housing in the future to not have to deal with this again. But the coming crisis is going to be in terms of, let me just summarize it here, tens of millions of houses that are going to become dilapidated to the point where no one will be able to live in them, no one will be able to sell them, no one will want to buy them, and we're going to have to do something with them. So that's the crisis I see coming probably by the end of this decade. So I will end this rant here. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please click like below. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to post them below or ask. And please do subscribe. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.